Good. It's good to see you all here again, and welcome again to anybody tuning in online. Very good to have you here with us as well. So good to have you all here on Sangha Day. It's been fantastic to gather again in these numbers. So really good to have you all here. So I'm very, very honoured and privileged to be introducing Paramabandhu for the Keynote Talk this afternoon. So I've lived with Paramabandhu for the last 3 years or so, and I've known him for about 7 or 8 years anyway, I think. And what to say about Paramabandhu? When Paramabandhu pre-COVID was a sort of the closest thing to a Dharma jet setter. He used to sort of go around. He was hugely in demand with the movement around the world, was in demand as a teacher, as a mentor, president to quite a number of centres around the world, but also was asked to go and teach in Mexico, in Spain, in Poland. And the thing I always noticed about Paramabandhu is he'd just say yes. You know, whatever he was asked to do, if he could do it at all, he'd just say yes. So the running joke was that it was nice of him to drop in occasionally. He would mostly, it was a good solid half of the year, he'd be away, working for the Dharma and befriending people. And so he's been, such a friend to the movement in that sense as well, and brought his many decades now of Dharma practice, in to sort of contribute in so many different situations and contexts. So, and that's especially true of the LBC here as well. You know, now Paramabandhu he's helped out a lot in a lot of different centres, but his contribution here to the LBC has been absolutely enormous. He was He was a Mitra convener for quite some time here at the centre, and also he was a chair. He was the chair of the centre here as well for 10 years, I believe. So for 6 years. So a huge contribution to the centre, and oversaw quite a number of the projects here in the centre as well. So we're still benefiting hugely from Paramabandhu's commitment and work at the centre as well. And also, it's such a desperate cliche to say on Sangha Day, but Paramabandhu does really embody this quality of Sangha, this sort of virtue of spiritual friendship. It's so cliched, you sort of need a little kind of cliched flag when you're saying, no, it's actually true with this individual. It's so many things that we can say can be just sort of bromides, can't they? But it's really true of Paramabandhu, and he's befriended so many people. I've really benefited from his friendship down through the years, but he's been a private preceptor to so many, a public preceptor to many, a Kalyana Mitra, a spiritual mentor to so many people as well. You couldn't ask for a better person to do our Keynote Talk on Sangha Day. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Paramabandhu.
Lovely. So thank you very much indeed, Amla Yodin, for your very kind words. And it's lovely to be with you all today, and anybody who's watching online as well. Again, really nice to be here. It's actually my second Sangha Day celebration, because in accordance with what Amla Yodin was saying, I actually zoomed into Krakow this morning and joined the Polish Sangha for a little bit of a Sangha celebration, which was very nice to be able to do. And it's lovely to be here back at home at the LBC. So, as Fire Tests Gold, that's the title of my talk. And I wanted to start by looking at how the Sangha began. So I want to go back to even before the time when there was a Sangha. So back in the before the Buddha, before he was enlightened, so Shakyamuni, before he was enlightened, he was on the quest for enlightenment. He was on the quest for finding liberation, and as part of this, he looked around at the local teachers around his time in northern India 2,500 years ago, He studied under the teachers that were around, learnt what he could, but he still hadn't found liberation. And then for quite some time, he practiced extreme asceticism. So the scriptures like to go into graphic details about the asceticism, like, he got so emaciated that, he could touch his spine through his belly, that sort of thing. I mean, maybe they're exaggerating, but anyway, you get the idea. It was extreme asceticism. But whilst he was doing that, he had 5 companions who were also practicing asceticism with them. So there were the 6 of them trying to do this, trying to find liberation through extreme ascetic practices, whether that was eating next to nothing or sitting. One of the traditions is the 5 fires, which is where you have a fire in each of the cardinal points and then the sun over your head, so it gets rather hot. So that's another of them. So he was practicing this with these ascetics, these other 5 ascetics. And in a way, this was, you could say, it was a sort of like a proto-Sangha. It was sort of a precursor of the Buddhist Sangha. However, what happened is the Buddha to be recognized that this extreme asceticism wasn't taking him where he wanted to go. He wasn't finding liberation through this. And he decided that he would have to try another way. And he gave up asceticism and started to eat just, a little bit, a bit of rice, something like that. But in the eyes of his friends, he'd sort of, as it were, betrayed them. He'd, in their words, resorted to luxury. It's interesting that rice gruel could be conceived as luxury. But anyway, he'd resorted to luxury. And so they abandoned him. So in a way, although you could say that it wasn't a real spiritual community, it's like he wasn't doing what the group was supposed to do, and so they ejected him, they rejected him. However, the Shakyamuni does go forward, and under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago, he gains enlightenment. And after gaining enlightenment, the question comes to him about whether he should try and teach the Dharma that he has learned, that he's understood. And he feels that that's going to be quite difficult because the Dharma is subtle and hard to understand. And most people are so caught up in their distractions and entanglements and cravings that it's very, very hard for them to see, he thought. However, a figure called Brahma Sahumpati appears before him, a sort of godlike figure, and begs him to teach the Dharma. And so that is what he decides to do. He decides to teach the Dharma. So whether you conceive of Brahma Sahumpati as a real, if you like, an existing external being, or whether you consider it as a sort of deeper part of the Buddhist psyche, in a way it doesn't really matter. You can sort of see it either way. But the outcome was the same, that he decided that he would try and teach the Dharma. And this seems to be a sort of key part of the Enlightenment experience, the importance of communication. Actually, there is a category called Pratcheka Buddhas. So Pratcheka Buddhas are a sort of category of Buddha that are said not to teach the Dharma. Now, whether they're just a theoretical construct, or whether there's some people suggest that maybe they're just like a Buddha who just had a few disciples and not many, or maybe the conditions in which they gained enlightenment didn't really allow for the teaching of the Dharma. We don't know. However, there seems to be this impulse to communicate the Dharma, and this is certainly our own teacher, Bhante Sangharachita, talks about enlightenment having this element of communication to it, awakening having this element of communication. And certainly for me on a much lower level, I could sort of recognise that from my own time when I was ordained. So I was ordained in Spain on a 4-month ordination course. And during that course, we meditated, we studied a lot. I mean, it was brilliant. I really, really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. But by the end of it, I felt I just received so much. I just wanted to give. I just wanted to give back. I wanted to pass on the Dharma that I'd learned. So it seems to me that sort of impulse, that desire to pass on is perhaps at a higher level maybe what the Buddha experiences as an enlightened being. So the Buddha decides to teach. He initially thinks of the teachers he's had before, but then realizes that they've died, so he can't teach them. And so instead he decides to go to his 5 former friends, even though they had rejected him, kind of ostracized him. He decides to go and see them. They're apparently living some distance away. And before he meets them, he, whilst he's still at Bodh Gaya, where he gained enlightenment, a couple of merchants from Orissa, that's in the east of India, they happen upon him. Actually, apparently a deceased relative communicates with him and says, this guy is a Buddha, you should go and make offerings to this guy. So off they go. They make offerings of apparently honey and rice gruel to the Buddha, and the Buddha teaches them, and they ask to become his disciples. So when we talk about formally becoming a disciple, we talk about going for refuge. That's taking refuge, going for refuge. And we normally talk about it in terms of the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, the 3 jewels. The Buddha, the historical Buddha, the ideal of enlightenment, the Dharma, the teaching or the truth, and then the Sangha. However, for these 2 merchants, there was no Sangha at that point. So they could only take the first 2 refuges. So they just went for refuge to the Buddha and to the Dharma. And then they just disappear from the pages of the scriptures. We don't actually know what happens to them. There's a legend that before they left the Buddha, they asked him for something to worship. And according to the legend, he pulled 8 hairs from his head. And they took them, and apparently they took them off to Burma, to present-day Myanmar, and they were eventually enshrined under a great big stupa. And anyway, that's a sort of Burmese legend about it. So again, make that of what you will, but it's quite a nice story. There's also a more, if you like, a contemporary imaginative reading of what happened, which is in Paramabandhu's very lovely long poem called Travellers from Orissa, in which he imagines what happened to these first 2 disciples of the Buddha. So you could read that in his book. It's very lovely poem, very, very worth reading. But as I say, we don't really know what happens to them. So they just disappear. The Buddha goes to Sarnath, where his 5 former friends were living at the time. They saw him coming from the distance, and they were like, "We're not speaking to him. He's like, he's like the degenerate, luxury-seeking guy, as it were, not like us, real hardcore ascetics." However, there's something in his demeanour, in his presence, that they can't stop themselves from getting up and responding to him when he arrives, and they do the traditional things of making a seat ready for him, getting him water and so on. And then they enter into communication. In effect, what they do is they have a retreat together. So we don't know how long this lasts, but you get the impression for at least a number of weeks, the Buddha is in dialogue with these 5 ascetics, practising together, meditating together, discussing the Dharma together, until eventually one of them, Kondanya, gets it and he gains enlightenment. And the Buddha's delighted and he says, Kondanya knows. And later on, this is just a little reading about Kondanya from another disciple later on. The elder Kondanya, strong in energy, who is enlightened after the awakened one, is repeatedly the obtainer of pleasurable abidings and seclusions. Whatever is to be attained by a disciple who does the instruction of the teacher, all that has been attained by him, vigilant and disciplined. Having great power and the threefold knowledge, skilled in knowing the thoughts of others, Kondanya, the awakened one's heir, pays homage at the teacher's feet. So I just wanted to just draw your attention to just that very last bit, which is he pays homage to the teacher's feet. So although he too was now enlightened, and according to the Buddha, one person's enlightenment is as it were the same as another person's enlightenment. In a way, the thing that distinguishes the Buddha is he did it off his own bat, as it were, rather than from a teacher. But yet, Kondanya has reverence towards the Buddha because he's so grateful, because the Buddha has been the person who has enabled him to gain liberation. So he's full of gratitude, full of reverence towards the Buddha. And then over the succeeding period of time, the other 4 ascetics also gain enlightenment. And in a way, this now is the first Sangha. So we now have an actual Sangha, a Sangha of 6 enlightened beings. And shortly after that, somebody called Yasha stumbles across the Buddha. So Yasha is a bit of a party animal, and he's had a particularly good or bad party, depending how you look at it. And they've been partying all night, and he sort of wakes in the early hours of the morning and is just horrified by the sort of debris after the party. He probably doesn't feel very good either. And he goes running out screaming, going, "It's horrible, it's terrible." And he sort of runs off into the forest and happens across the Buddha. And the Buddha says, "Well, this isn't horrible, this is not terrible." And they get into discussion, and he too, I won't give the full story, but in time, he too gains enlightenment, followed by 4 of his close friends, followed by 50 of their friends. So it was very catching at the time. So by now you've got 61 enlightened beings. So this is the early Sangha. And at this point, the Buddha instructs all the other 60 to all go off in different directions to teach the Dharma for the benefit of beings, for the welfare of beings, for the happiness of beings. So this is the Sangha, at least this is the Sangha at its highest, this community of enlightened beings acting for the welfare of the world, acting for the welfare of beings. And in a way you can see within that, hopefully, there's sort of 2 movements, 2 sort of, if you like, emotion's not quite the right word, but I'll let it pass. It's sort of emotional movement. So one is a response of gratitude and reverence, particularly towards the Buddha. Actually, even the Buddha expresses reverence in his case towards the Dharma. Well, I won't go into that just now. But also a movement, if you like, downwards, or to those who are suffering in a response of compassion, or what we would experience as compassion. So you've got these 2 movements that are sort of, in a sense, going on within the Sangha. So what about us? So assuming we're not all enlightened beings, what about us? Well, for us, our particular Sangha really started in 1968 when we had the first ordinations in the Triratna Buddhist order. And Bhante Sangharajta, who founded the order, expressed it in this way. He said that those people, that their understanding of going for refuge, in other words, their understanding of practising and committing to the Dharma, coincided to some extent with that is, with Bhante's understanding. Okay? So their understanding coincided with his. And I just brought a photo of the time, just nice to have a little visual aid for a moment. Sorry it's not bigger, but anyway, hopefully. So this is, I believe, I don't know if you can see here, so this is Bhante on this side. And this is, I believe, is Sarah, who's going to become Sujata. So one of the first women to be ordained. So there were 12 people ordained in the first ordinations, and she was one of them. And Bhante here is just holding the kesa, and it's when the kesa goes around your neck that you become a member of the order. So what Bhante says is that their understanding coincided with his understanding, but in a way, understanding is perhaps not a very good word. It's fair enough, but it's more like a shared spirit or a shared atmosphere or a shared culture that is caught. It's not just a sort of intellectual understanding. When we come together as a Sangha, it forms a Sangha to the extent that we share in this atmosphere, share in this sort of culture or indefinable spirit. I remember very vividly an experience of this connectedness back in the early 90s. So I was, at the time, I was visiting America, and I arrived at some friends of the family's house, and when I arrived, I started feeling really, really ill. I later discovered I'd got hepatitis A, a kind of food poisoning, so I was like super nauseous. And they were really kind, the family that I stayed with, but nevertheless, I felt kind of uncomfortable, and particularly uncomfortable being ill, feeling so ill and being there. And then I was just with them for a couple of days, and then I had a short flight over to another part of Northeast America, where we have a retreat center called Aryaloka. So I got the flight, and I was met at the airport by somebody called Vidyavati, who was an order member I'd never actually met before. I'd never come across her, probably because, well, I think she's originally from New Zealand, and she'd spent her time in America, so I'd never come across her. But I just instantly felt comfortable in a way that quite surprised me. Even though I felt horribly ill, it was sort of all right to be ill with her. In a way that, even though they'd been very kind, these other people, I hadn't felt I could quite relax in. So there was something about, there was immediately this shared understanding, this shared sort of sense of spirit of what we were doing with our lives that meant I could really relax. And yeah, it was a real, it's a real eye-opener for me in that way, in terms of this, how it was possible to connect with someone I really didn't know, but we were in the same Sangha, and I really felt that sense of being in the same Sangha together. So this sort of shared culture, atmosphere, is of course, has been shaped by our founder, shaped by Bhante. I mean, a Sangha is always particular. If a Sangha isn't particular, it will just break apart. If we're all sort of nominally Buddhist but doing different things, it's not going to cohere together as a Sangha. That's why if you decide you want to commit to a Sangha, which in a way, I don't know who's becoming a Mitra tonight, but if you're becoming a Mitra tonight, that's what you're doing, you're committing to this Sangha. You're committing to a particular Sangha, not to sort of Sanghas in general. And of course, there are lots of different Sanghas in the world. So our own Sangha, founded by Bhante, has particular emphases that, for example, include friendship. Friendship's a very strong emphasis in our tradition. Includes that it has the same ordination for everybody. I mean, it was kind of interesting that, just going back to this photo for a moment, because I think the reason we have the photo is because it went into the newspapers. It was a newsworthy thing because it was the first woman who'd been ordained into the Buddhist tradition for, I think, centuries, because the ordination for women had died out centuries ago, and so this hit the headlines apparently in '68 for that reason. So it's the same ordination. Bhante also emphasizes the importance of this term, going for refuge, of committing to the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and also an altruistic side. For those of you who've come across it, the Bodhisattva ideal, the ideal of pursuing enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, not just for ourselves. So I just want to pick up on a couple of those points. I want to pick up on, first of all, this idea of going for refuge being primary and what that means. And I also want to pick up on the thing of a shared understanding. That'll be, in a way, the main part of the talk going forward, and then there'll just be a little bit at the end. So what it means that going for refuge is primary, what it means is that we make an individual commitment, and what that means is taking responsibility for our mental states. I remember the first time I heard this, it was just before I was ordained, and some order member sort of mentioned it in passing, that we're responsible for our mental states. And it just, I don't know, it just hit me like a lightning flash or something. It was like, oh, actually, that's quite significant. And being responsible for our mental states includes really starting to notice how we, as it were, cultivate our mental states. I remember years ago I was just sort of crossing the road from the centre here, and I just noticed this flash of anger appear in my mind, and I started to watch as I created this story that somehow justified this anger that seemingly came out of nowhere in particular. And then I just stopped and thought, why am I doing this? And it was like, actually, I don't have to do this. I don't have to do anger. This is what I'm doing, anger. I don't have to do it. And so I stopped doing it. I don't mean I've never been angry since, but that would be quite a claim, wouldn't it? But the point was, I could see that I was doing it. And that gives you choice, of course. That means you've got choice over your lives. So, in some ways, it sounds very easy to be responsible for one's mental states, but you may have guessed that it isn't so straightforward. There's a tradition in Buddhism that originates probably somewhere between the 5th and 10th century, something, or a bit after that, called mind training. And mind training was originally a whispered teaching. It was a whispered teaching because it was felt it was too risky to write it down. It had to be passed on to only appropriate people. Anyway, it's now written down, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about mind training. So the essence of it is that there are, if you like, 3 grades of difficulty in which one can practice being responsible for one's mental states. So the first is just when something unpleasant happens, actually particularly to do with another person. So somebody is behaving badly in some way. Well, it's not personal to you, but you just see somebody, I don't know, two people having an argument or something like that, and it's kind of a bit unpleasant to witness it. Or there's something you don't like about somebody's manner, or they're being very noisy or something like that. So that's the first degree. So is when something that's not in a way personal to you is happening. The second degree is when somebody actually does something to you that you don't like. So somebody shouts at you, hits you, or robs you, or does something that you don't like. And then the third degree, so this is the highest degree, the hardest degree, is when somebody that you've helped or that you would expect would support you, when they harm you or let you down. In a sense, when you've been betrayed by someone who you would least expect to betray you. So there's these three degrees of difficulty that we might encounter. And what mind training says is we should treat these as an excellent opportunity. We should treat these as though we discovered treasure. Okay? So when somebody's been horrible to you, you should treat it as though you found some treasure. In the verses, there's different forms of the mind training, but this is verses that relate to these three grades, as it were. So when I see ill-natured people overwhelmed by wrong deeds and pain, may I cherish them as something rare, as though I'd found a treasure trove. So that's the first degree. You've encountered something difficult to you, and you try and respond to it as though you found treasure. Second degree. When someone out of envy does me wrong by insulting me and the like, may I accept defeat and offer victory to them. So you don't try and get one back. You don't try and seek revenge. You actually try and cultivate a mind of love towards them. And then thirdly, even if someone whom I've helped and in whom I've placed my hopes does great wrong in harming me, may I see them as an excellent spiritual friend. The reason why you try and see them as an excellent spiritual friend is because they can help you develop qualities. That very provocation is an opportunity to develop qualities that might not have arisen if you hadn't been provoked in that way. So in other words, what these mind training are getting at is that spiritual progress is more important than being right. Spiritual progress is more important than getting revenge, for example. This is what these teachings are directing us to. Actually, the Buddha, so predating this mind training, in some ways was even stronger. There's this wonderful parable of the saw, and he says to his disciples, even if bandits were to savagely sever you limb by limb with a double-handed saw, even then, whoever of you harbours ill will at heart would not be upholding my teaching. Even in such a situation you should train yourselves thus. Neither shall our minds be affected by this, nor for this matter shall we give vent to evil words, but we shall remain full of concern and pity, with a mind of love, and we shall not give in to hatred. On the contrary, we shall live projecting thoughts of universal love to those very persons, making them, as well as the whole world, the object of our thoughts of universal love, thoughts that have grown great, exalted, and measureless. We shall dwell radiating these thoughts which are void of hostility and ill will. It is in this way that you train yourselves. So in other words, training ourselves to respond with love, even in the face of very severe provocation. Obviously that's quite a high ideal and we're going to almost certainly fall short. But it's important to be clear about what we're aiming for. It's important to be clear about the principle. So that's what we're aiming for. That's what we're aiming for, and taking responsibility for our mind to not cultivate hatred, but to cultivate love, to cultivate patient acceptance. But of course, it's very easy not to take responsibility. And I'm just going to mention a few ways that we don't take responsibility. So probably the number one is by blame. That's a sort of ready off-the-shelf go-to thing. When we feel upset by something, we look to who we can blame. I mean, I notice it in my mind, even just like little trivial things like, I can't find some object in my room, and I immediately think, who's moved it? It's a sort of default of it must be somebody else's fault. It can't possibly be my fault. So it's very easy to, as it were, reach for blame. Whether that is to something mild or sort of more serious hostility or something unpleasant to a friend or some kind of social injustice, it's very easy to respond with blame, to respond particularly with righteous indignation. That's always one that can very, because you've got right on your side, so you can feel justified. But actually, to the extent it's righteous indignation, it's an unskillful mental state. It means you're not really taking responsibility for your mind. You're not cultivating love. And actually, in a sense, you're moving into a kind of a victim mode. So that doesn't mean to say that we don't try and help in the world. Of course not. But if it's based on ill will, if that apparently trying to help is rooted in ill will, then that's not actually what we're trying to do in practicing the Dharma. Because as the Bhante says, as the well-known lines from the Dhammapada, hatred does not cease by hatred. Or another little famous rhyme of mine, which is, someone convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. So you can browbeat someone with your right view that they should be doing something, but if you convince them against their will, it makes no difference. They'll just continue. So it needs to be based on love, particularly on kshanti, to use it's one of the perfections, which means something like patient acceptance. It's very, very beautiful quality of a loving tolerance. Tolerance here doesn't mean just sort of putting up with things like a doormat, but it's the ability to be able to disagree with someone who holds different opinions without hating them for them holding different opinions. Another way that we can easily not take responsibility is through self-pity. And that may easily go with blame. We can fall into a poor me when something doesn't go our way. And again, it's like we've lost the reins of our lives. We're not taking responsibility for our minds when we fall into self-pity. And I would also say, slightly at the risk of being controversial, but hey, when we're not practicing self-metta, that is also not taking responsibility for our mind. What I mean by, I don't mean that we should always be going around saying, I love me, I'm wonderful. I don't mean self-metta in that sort of parody form. I more mean that when we fall into berating ourselves, criticizing ourselves for not living up to some idealized version, in a sense, we're just not accepting who we are. We're sort of buying into a story of, how terrible I am, and if only I had, a better body, a better mind, was more intelligent, was more talented, or all the different things that we can fall into, then I'd be okay. Then, people would love me, or then I wouldn't suffer, or whatever it is. But any of those thoughts are actually a form of spiritual laziness. They're not actually taking the reins of who one is, with one's positive qualities and one's weaknesses, and having metta towards all of that and moving forward on that basis. So it's just very easy it's a slightly letting ourselves off the hook in a certain kind of way when we just fall into those habitual patterns. Now, I don't say that's easy to do. A lot of people do struggle with self-metta. I recognise that. In fact, I wrote a book on metta because it's quite tricky. But it's just important to really recognise that, to really recognise when we're not taking the reins on our life. And then finally, another way that can sometimes be a bit subtle of not taking responsibility is when we're wanting other people to be slightly different from how they are, instead of working on ourselves, instead of changing ourselves. I remember, again, it goes back quite a long time, when my parents were still alive, and I'd a while before come out to them as being gay. And what I noticed is that I not only wanted them to be okay about me being gay, and they were actually kind of really, really good, but I somehow wanted them to approve of it. And at a certain point, I realised that, in a way, given they were born in the 1920s, this was an unrealistic expectation that I had on them. From their culture, their background, but also it was in a sense that I wasn't fully growing up. I was still staying in, mummy, daddy, I want your approval sort of thing, in a certain kind of way. So I think it can be quite subtle that we can do that. We can try and, in a way, seek approval from others, which again is not completely taking responsibility for our own minds and for who we are. Similarly, we can do that with the Sangha, in the sense of wanting the Sangha to be different, which in a way, when we're doing that, we're not really relating to the Sangha as Sangha. So, we might have this idea that the London Buddhist Centre should be doing a soup kitchen for the poor and needy. I mean, it's just a random thing, although it has been suggested in the past. And, of course, one can make that request. But really, if one's expecting the LBC should do X, Y, Z, it's like we're not really taking responsibility for ourselves. It'd be very different if you came up and said, look, I've got this great idea. I'd really love to start a soup kitchen, and can I do it with your blessings here at the LBC, at the empty space next door, where the larder is. That would be a whole different matter, because I'm saying, this is what I want to do. Can you help me with this? But if we fall into, you should be like this, then we're not taking responsibility for our minds. You sort of see the difference between the two. Okay, so that's taking responsibility. Then there's this other aspect of a shared understanding. So, in a way, it's not enough just to work on our minds on our own. Of course, we need to do that. But we also need to engage with others, and particularly emotionally engage with others. I don't know about you, but if I'm sitting with my eyes shut on my cushion, I can cultivate metta to just about anybody, as long as they don't actually come in front of me and impinge on me with their horrible person, as it were. See what I mean? Anyone who I sort of, as it were, dislike in an interaction, when I shut my eyes and they're not actually bothering me, I love you, it's fine, sort of thing. But it's when we actually have to deal with other people, the real thing, that's when the challenge arises. In a way, that's the whole point of this sort of mind training. So in a way, this is like the real test of whether, whether we're really practicing as a Sangha, as part of the Sangha. The title of the quote actually comes from a quote from Seneca, which was, as fire tests gold, so misfortune tests brave men. So I think you could say, as fire tests gold, so other people, especially other people in the Sangha, test our practice of Sangha. So in a way, that's where we really get to find out how strong our practice is, how much we really are taking responsibility for our minds when we engage with other people who are also trying to practice. And of course, engaging with others can be absolutely delightful, and it can be a complete headache as well. And this seems to be, even in the Buddha's day, there were difficulties. There's a famous thing called the quarrel at Kosambi, in which there was a dispute over the interpretation of rules. So they had two senior monks, one who was like an expert on the Vinaya, which is the rules of conduct, and one was an expert on the suttas, on the teachings. And the guy who was an expert on the teachings had the misfortune or audacity or whatever to go to the toilet and leave a vessel of unused water, washing water, behind. So that's what he did. And the other guy, the rules guy, said, "Did you know that's an offence to do that?" And the sutta man says, "No, I didn't know that was an offence, but I'll acknowledge, if that is an offence, I will acknowledge it." And then the rules guy said, "Well, actually, if you didn't know it was an offence, never mind. It's not an offence. If you didn't know it, that's fine." But he goes off and tells his own pupils, says, "Do you know that guy who's like the expert on the suttas? He can't tell what's an offence and what's not an offence." And then this man's pupils goes to the other guy's pupils and says, "Your teacher doesn't even know what's an offence and what not offence." And of course that gets back to the sutta guy who says, "First the guy tells me it's an offence, then he tells me it's not offence. The guy's a liar." Anyway, so this is how it escalates over this, seemingly rather trivial thing. People start taking sides, and they're just, brawling, at least not physically, or as far as we know, not physically, but certainly arguing verbally with each other. So eventually somebody tells the Buddha, and so the Buddha comes to see them, but he can't do anything with them. Even the Buddha can't bring them to their senses. They actually only come to their senses when the people, the lay people who they're begging from, who are giving them their food, stop feeding them. Which is quite telling, isn't it? Only when the belly gets empty that people will come to their senses. And I think, it can often be trivial things. I mean, it happens in all sorts of, doesn't it, in domestic situations. It's often the sparking point for an argument can often be the trivial things, like who has left their cup unwashed on the side. I had this thing when I first moved into or early on when I was moving to community upstairs, when someone cut start a new loaf, cut the slice off the crust, and then he'd have the audacity to turn it round and cut off the other crust off the other end. And I'm thinking, you can't do that. The bread will go dry, sort of thing. Anyway, fortunately we were able to get into discussion about it, and he was saying, well, look, I really like the crust. We get through this bread so fast, it doesn't have a chance to get dry. And I thought, okay. So anyway, I still didn't quite approve, but I sort of learned to live with it. I saw his point of view. So yeah, it can easily do that. Another thing I've recognised, I was telling Amity Odin this morning, although he wasn't completely convinced, is that I think we very easily notice the good things that we do, like, all the times I empty the dishwasher, make dinner, things like that. I don't notice the things that I don't do, particularly like fix the lock at the top of the stairs. And then for other people, it's easy to notice the things that they don't do, that they should be doing, and not noticing the things they don't do, because it's not in my sort of, purview, as it were. So again, it's interesting just to watch out for those biases. So, I mean, obviously there can be much more serious causes for disputation, but just those, you're living or you're around other people in the Sangha who are practising gives you like loads of brilliant opportunities to really see where you are with your mental states. It really tests our practice. And so for that reason, I'd really encourage you to take whatever opportunities you have to engage with the Sangha. So, spend time with other people in the Sangha, meet up with people. Again, back in the 90s, there was this, we had this sort of a bit of a culture of spending an evening a week with the same person. And I used to spend every Friday evening for a number of years with someone who's a very dear friend called Nagadeva. He wasn't ordained, he's ordained now. So it was just lovely, just spending a long period of time really, really getting to know him well. Live together if you can. I mean, you might be able to, even if you can't, you might be able to do that, as it were, permanently, as it were. But even temporarily, like when you go on retreat, you get an opportunity to live with other people who are practicing, which is one of the reasons why Sangha is so good. You get an opportunity quite often. When we were building Vajrasana, there was a whole discussion about whether we would have single rooms or not. And I'm afraid we decided against it. Actually, there are one or two single rooms. I mean, occasionally there are, for medical or other reasons, people do need a single room. But we wanted people to have that experience of sharing room together, to that be part of the retreat experience. I've just come back from Adhisthana, which is our sort of like international HQ retreat centre. And I was there with Maitreya Bandhu and Jana Varch on a meeting. And we always share a room together when we go to that meeting. So it was lovely. We just, the three of us, shared a meeting, shared the room, hung out together, had endless post-mortems about the meeting. It was really, really useful. really, really nice. If you can, work together. Again, you might not be able to give up your job, but you can perhaps support a team or support a class team or support a retreat team. But of course, if you can work in a Buddhist situation, that's brilliant. Right now we're looking for a property manager here at the LBC. Adhisthana that I just mentioned, they've got quite a number of jobs because they're expanding the team. So there's a whole opportunities there if you're interested to live and work in a Buddhist situation. And the manager there, Paramabandhu, is a lovely guy. We were just talking at the weekend, and he was saying, if you're interested, just get in contact with him. You'll be very happy. And that's for both. That's for everybody. It's not just a men's or a women's situation. So they're just such great opportunities if you engage, because it really throws up stuff. It really gives you an opportunity to practice. So I've talked about these things about taking responsibility for your mind, about having a shared understanding and engaging with each other. Maybe what you'll be able to see from this is that the Sangha is not a fixed thing. I mean, we loosely talk about the Sangha either more broadly in terms of everybody trying to practice their Dharma, or more narrowly in terms of enlightened beings or very spiritually advanced beings. But in a way, the Sangha sort of flickers in and out of existence in the sense that each moment that we're taking responsibility for our minds and we're engaging in the shared understanding of the Dharma, like Sangha appears. And then each time that we're not doing that or we let it slip, it kind of disappears. So it's something that's in a way constantly appearing and disappearing. It's not like a fixed thing. So yeah, when we so there's something a bit magical about that in a way. This sort of thing that it's this sort of it's a bit like a light is actually, as I was reading the other day, a light is like a hailstorm of photons. It's not a single thing, but if it's happening with high frequency, we just get a light. So when the Sangha, when people, the potential Sangha members, are continuously engaging, you get this appearance of Sangha that is much more, in a way, visible, even though actually it's just arising moment by moment. So I just wanted to finish with, again, going back to the ideal. So I started in some ways with the ideal, with the Buddha and the early disciples, the 60 enlightened disciples of the Buddha. And I spoke of, within that, the quality of looking up, even in the enlightened beings, this quality of reverence, of devotion, and also, as it were, looking down, in a sense of compassion towards suffering. But you could also think of, in a way, looking across as sort of enjoyment of other people in the Sangha who are sort of kind of practicing with you at a similar sort of level. And in a way, this is echoed by the idea of the Sambhogakaya, which is translated as the body of mutual enjoyment. So you've got this idea of, excuse me for doing a little bit of, I can see everyone's going, oh no, not a little bit of tiredness, but stay with it, we're nearly there. This idea of three bodies of the Buddha. So you've got like the physical body, and then you've got like the Dharma essence that's sort of beyond words that the Buddha has realized. But you also have this body of mutual enjoyment, which we, if you like, experience as the archetypal Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the Buddhas that appear in visionary and beautiful visionary form. And so, we have that here. Although on the one hand, it looks like Shakyamuni, but it's actually Amitabha. This is actually the Buddha of the West, disguised as Shakyamuni. It's actually an archetypal Buddha. The clue actually is these these red lotuses, because Amitabha is a red figure and he appears on a red lotus. He's the embodiment of infinite, well, his Latin name means infinite light, but he's the embodiment also of infinite love. The love is the light, so it's just mass of love. And one of, he's particularly associated with Avalokiteshvara. So Avalokiteshvara is a figure of compassion, who, if you like, reverences Amitabha. He's got Amitabha above his head. He's holds a wish-fulfilling jewel between his central two hands. Some versions have 4, sometimes 1,000 arms, but in the 4-armed version he's holding a mala, and with each mala, and in the other hand a lotus. So the lotus is an image for spiritual development. The mala, as he's chanting his mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, that's going out to all beings in out of compassion, to help all beings in all the different sort of realms. So you've got this looking up to Amitabha, you've also got this going out to all beings. And just finally, to finish with a little story about Avalokiteshvara, so again a little legend but hopefully tells us something, is that there's a story that at one time there's this great big ocean, and the gods had this idea of stirring it up to see what they could find in the ocean. So they started stirring this. They found like they managed to make this big stirring rod. And initially all sorts of treasures started coming. So people are going for all these great treasures that started appearing out of the ocean. But then finally what came up was a big pot of poison, of like really deadly poison. Of course, everybody stands back at this point. But it's at this point that Avalokiteshvara steps forward and he drinks the poison. And in doing so, his throat turns blue. So he was able to take the poison, but it changed him. And in a way, that's what compassion is. If we practice the Dharma, if we create the Sangha, also sometimes we may have to take poison, but it will transform us.
Thanks so much, Paramabandhu. God, what a hour-long extravaganza. That was brilliant. Thank you very much. Every time I hear Paramabandhu teach, and I was very lucky to be in a study group with Paramabandhu for a number of years, and I always just remember thinking what clarity you could bring to a lot of these issues, really kind of like make something so clear, and I've really, really appreciated that. Again this afternoon, I think you've done that, and also what you've done is you've brought the historical and made it personal as well for our own lives, but also the mythical and made it personal for our own lives as well. And there was so much in it, so thank you very, very much, Paramabandhu. We're always so lucky to have you teach here at the centre, and hopefully not long before we get to see you again. So maybe we can just give one more minute.